He sat behind his massive desk, oozing confidence and authority, until the door swung open and his face drained of color. The man he had arrogantly denied a loan now stood before him in an expensive suit, but not as a customer. He was his new boss. What happened next turned everything upside down. But let's start from the beginning. It was a bright Monday morning when David Carter, a well-dressed black man in his late 30s, stepped into the high-end corporate branch of Central National Bank in downtown Chicago. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a Rolex that subtly gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Despite his confident demeanor, he was here for something many would consider routine, applying for a business loan. David had spent years building his real estate empire. He owned multiple properties across the city, and now he was looking to expand. The numbers were in his favor: impeccable credit score, substantial collateral, and a solid financial history. He had all the documents neatly prepared in his leather briefcase. But the moment he approached the desk, he could feel the shift in energy. The bank's branch manager, Richard Whitman, a middle-aged white man with slicked-back hair and an expensive suit, barely lifted his gaze from his computer. His cold, scrutinizing eyes flickered across David's polished appearance, before settling on his face with thinly veiled condescension. "How can I help you?" Richard asked, his tone sterile, as if he were already dismissing whatever David was about to say. David extended a firm handshake, which Richard ignored. First red flag. "I'd like to apply for a business loan. I have all the necessary paperwork ready," David said confidently. Richard exhaled sharply, his lips curling into a patronizing smirk. He took the papers without enthusiasm and began flipping through them. The further he read, the more his expression shifted, first from boredom to disbelief, then to something more irritated, almost offended. "A $2 million loan?" Richard scoffed. "And what kind of business do you run?" David maintained his composure. "Real estate investments. I own several properties across the city, and I'm looking to acquire another one in a prime location." Richard clicked his tongue, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Mr. Carter, I'll be honest with you," he said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "We have strict policies, and this kind of loan, it's just too high risk." David frowned. "High risk? My financials are solid. My credit score is 810. I have assets worth over $10 million. What exactly is the risk?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk deepening. "It's not just about numbers, Mr. Carter. There are other factors we take into account: stability, long-term feasibility. Certain demographics are historically more prone to financial difficulties, you understand." David felt a flash of heat crawl up his spine. He knew exactly what Richard was implying. "Demographics?" David repeated, his jaw tightening. "Are you saying my race makes me a financial liability?" Richard gave an artificial chuckle. "Now, let's not get dramatic. I'm just saying the board might not be comfortable approving this given the circumstances. But hey, maybe a smaller loan? 50, maybe 100,000? The blatant condescension in his voice was enough to make David's hands curl into fists beneath the desk. This wasn't about risk. This wasn't about financial feasibility. This was about control. About power. About Richard not wanting a successful black man walking into his bank and demanding something he thought David shouldn't have. Hatred bubbled in David's chest, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he calmly gathered his documents, stood up, and gave Richard a pointed look. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Whitman," David said smoothly, "but I think you just made a serious mistake." Richard only chuckled, waving him off. "Best of luck finding another bank that'll take on that kind of risk." Little did he know, his words would come back to haunt him. 2 weeks later, Richard was in his office, sipping on his overpriced espresso when his assistant Amanda burst in, looking pale. "Sir, we have a problem." Richard sighed, annoyed. Unless someone just robbed us, I don't want to hear it. Amanda hesitated. The new regional director is here. He's conducting an unannounced evaluation of all major branches. Richard sat up straighter. The new what? Corporate sent an email last night. He's visiting in person. Before Richard could process that, his office door swung open. And there stood David Carter. Richard's face drained of color. David was no longer just the high-risk loan applicant. He was standing in front of Richard in an even sharper suit, a badge from Central National Bank's corporate division pinned to his lapel. Mr. Whitman, David said, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. Let's have a conversation. Richard shot up from his chair, his usual arrogance evaporating. Mr. Carter, I didn't realize. David smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just won a game the other player didn't know they were in. That I'm the new regional director? David finished for him. Yes, I figured. I also figured that your name would be one of the first I'd hear when reviewing loan application inconsistencies at this branch. Richard swallowed hard. You work for corporate? I don't just work for corporate, David corrected. I oversee multiple branches, including this one. And as of today, I have full authority over hiring, termination, and internal investigations. Richard's hands trembled slightly. Look, Mr. Carter, if there was a misunderstanding about your loan... David cut him off. There was no misunderstanding, he said. You saw my application, my financials, and you chose to deny me, not because of my qualifications, but because of your own biases. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but David continued. Now, the board will be made aware of this situation, and depending on their decision, you might want to update your resume. Amanda's eyes widened from the doorway. Richard looked like he was about to collapse. 2 weeks later, Richard Whitman was gone. His resignation letter was quietly processed, and his office was cleared out overnight. Officially, it was framed as a personnel restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. David Carter had walked in as a rejected loan applicant. Now, he sat in Richard's old chair, feet casually propped on the mahogany desk, signing approvals for business loans that should have never been denied in the first place. As he looked out over the Chicago skyline, a small, satisfied smile curled on his lips. Funny how things work out, he murmured to himself. Justice had been served.